I thought I knew what betrayal felt like, until I caught my wife with our neighbor. What came next wasn't just the unraveling of my marriage, it was the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and myself. Looking back, I never imagined my life could take such a twisted turn. For the longest time, I thought Kate and I were your typical happy couple. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who doesn't? We always found a way to make it work, or so I believed. When we moved into our new neighborhood, I was optimistic. It felt like the perfect opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to create new memories, build connections with our neighbors, and settle into what I naively thought would be a peaceful life. At first, things seemed to fall into place. We quickly hit it off with Mike and Laura, our neighbors next door. Mike had this magnetic charm about him, successful, confident, and always quick with a smooth remark. He was the kind of guy who made you feel like he had it all figured out. Laura, on the other hand, was his opposite, quiet, reserved, and incredibly kind. I used to joke that they balanced each other out perfectly. But as it turned out, that perfect balance was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. In the beginning, everything felt better than normal. Kate seemed happier than I'd seen her in years. We spent our weekends exploring the town, trying out new restaurants, and going on hikes. It felt like we were finally in sync again. But as time passed, small cracks began to appear, cracks I couldn't ignore once I noticed them. The first sign that something was off with Kate hit me out of the blue. She suddenly started going out more often to meet with friends, something she'd never done much before. I wasn't the kind of guy to begrudge her having her own life, in fact, I encouraged it. But this felt different. Girls' nights turned into staying out until all hours of the night. The excuses started piling up too, stuck at work, caught in traffic, or simply losing track of time. It was always something. Then there was the issue with her phone. That thing became a permanent fixture in her hand or was tucked away in her bag, always on silent. Kate used to leave it charging on the counter without a second thought. Now, it was like her lifeline, something she couldn't bear to leave out in the open. These little changes ate at me. At first, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I understand that everyone deserves their privacy, but this felt different, like Kate wasn't just keeping things to herself but actively hiding something. The way she'd get these texts was unsettling. Her face would light up with this subtle glow, sometimes accompanied by a soft laugh. She'd quickly type out a reply, but the moment she noticed me watching, her expression would shut down. It was as if the happiness she had moments earlier wasn't meant for me to see. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. You know, that nagging gut feeling that whispers something's off but you try to ignore because you don't want to come across as insecure or jealous. That was me for months. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Her demeanor toward me started shifting too. Kate had always been the one to plan our date nights, cuddle up on the couch, or suggest weekend adventures. But now, it felt like she could barely stand to be in the same room with me. Our conversations became cold, perfunctory. She was physically present, but emotionally, she was somewhere else entirely. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, moving around her while she barely acknowledged my existence. I tried convincing myself it was just a rough patch, work stress, a personal phase, anything to explain it. But each time I buried my suspicions, something would happen to bring them roaring back. One night, she came home reeking of cologne, one that wasn't mine. Sure, it could have been innocent, maybe a brush against someone at a bar or a friendly hug. But it was strong, too strong for a casual encounter. That moment, it became impossible to keep lying to myself. Something was seriously wrong. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I felt cornered, desperate for answers. I started noticing things, when she left, when she came home. I'd glance at her calendar, cross-checking her supposed late nights at work. At first, everything lined up, and I almost let myself believe her. But then, one night, it didn't. That was the night I followed her. I hated myself for it, felt like some amateur detective spiraling into madness. But the way she'd been acting, the gnawing uncertainty, I couldn't just let it go. I kept my distance, trying to stay unseen, but my heart was racing the whole time. She wasn't at work. She wasn't running errands. She was at a cafe, just a few blocks from our neighborhood. And she wasn't alone. There she was, sitting across from Mike, our charming, ever-confident neighbor. It wasn't some casual coffee between friends. I could tell by the way they leaned in toward each other, how her face lit up at his jokes, how she hung on his every word. It was the little things that stung the most, her smile, her laugh, the sparkle in her eyes. All the things that used to be just for me were now directed at him. I stood there frozen, watching what I couldn't unsee, feeling like my entire world was unraveling one painful thread at a time. I remember the moment vividly, that gut-wrenching pit in my stomach, like the ground beneath me had disappeared. My hands were shaking as I snapped the picture of Kate and Mike sitting together. A part of me tried to reason it away, maybe you're overreacting, maybe this isn't what it looks like. But deep down, I already knew. I could feel it in every fiber of my being, that raw, unmistakable sting of betrayal. It was my first taste of that hollow, crushing reality, but it wouldn't be the last. This was just the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel everything I thought I knew, about my marriage, my life, and, most painfully, about who Kate really was. As much as I wanted to confront her right then and there, I couldn't. Not yet. I needed more answers, more certainty. And I couldn't talk to Laura either. What could I possibly say? Hey, just a heads up, I think your husband is having an affair with my wife. It sounded absurd even in my own head. So, I stayed quiet, bottling up the storm inside me, hoping I could hold it together just a little longer. But the truth was, keeping it all inside was tearing me apart. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kate and Mike, laughing, leaning in, touching. Each time I looked at her, I felt a wave of nausea. And every time I saw him, I had to fight the overwhelming urge to wipe that smug, confident smile off his face with my fists. Outwardly, I managed to keep my composure. But inside, I was unraveling, a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and, if I'm honest, fear. Fear of what I would uncover. Fear of how this would change everything I thought I understood about my life. One afternoon, as I paced around the neighborhood, trying to sort out the chaos in my head, I bumped into Laura. She was out walking her dog. For a moment, I considered just nodding and walking away. I mean, what could I say to her? How could I even look her in the eye, knowing that her husband was betraying her with my wife? But she called out to me, and just like that, there was no escape. I forced myself to smile, plastering on the mask of normalcy as I stopped to make small talk. I asked how she was doing, pretending I didn't know the truth that was eating away at me. As she spoke, I found myself studying her. Laura had this quiet, gentle way about her, a certain shyness that could make her easy to overlook. But as I watched her, I started noticing something deeper. Beneath her soft exterior was someone sharper, more observant. And maybe it was my own mind playing tricks, but I swore I saw a sadness in her eyes, a heaviness she seemed to carry. In that moment, it hit me, what if she already knew? What if she, like me, was piecing together fragments of a life that was slowly spiraling out of control? Or maybe she didn't know, and all of this was my own burden to bear. Either way, I had to find out. So, I decided to test the waters. I casually steered the conversation toward relationships, pretending it was just idle chatter. I asked how things were between her and Mike, throwing in a mention about how busy Kate had been with work lately. That's when Laura's guard slipped for the first time. She sighed, gave me a tired smile, and said things had been distant between her and Mike. He'd been distracted, working late more often, preoccupied with something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Her words hit me like a gut punch. It was like listening to a mirror image of my own marriage. The similarities were eerie, almost too perfect to be a coincidence. But what struck me even more was how she said it. There wasn't any anger in her tone, just resignation. Like she'd convinced herself this was normal, something to be endured. She kept talking, sharing how she trusted Mike despite the rough patches they'd been through in the past. He's always been loyal in the end, she said, as if trying to reassure herself more than me. I wanted to scream. To shake her and force her to see the truth. But I held back. I couldn't just drop this bomb on her, not yet, not without her being ready to hear it. As she continued, I realized Laura had no idea. She was living the same lie I had been, rationalizing all the signs, ignoring the red flags. And it made me furious. Not at her, but at the situation. Seeing that fragile hope in her eyes, built on nothing but deceit, was almost too much to bear. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let her go on like this, not when I had the truth weighing me down. Taking a deep breath, I interrupted her. Laura, I said softly. My tone must have caught her off guard because she stopped mid-sentence, looking at me with curiosity and maybe a little concern. What is it? She asked, her voice hesitant. I struggled for the right words. I don't know how else to say this, but I think you need to know the truth about Mike. Her face tensed, and she forced a weak laugh that was closer to a sob. You must be mistaken. Mike? No, he wouldn't. I cut her off gently. Laura, I wish I were wrong. I really do. But I'm not. I've seen them. I followed Kate one day, and she met up with Mike. They were together, and it wasn't just some friendly meeting, it was intimate. Her expression shifted to disbelief as she started shaking her head. No, you're mistaken. It's not possible, she murmured, her voice trembling. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to take it all back. To tell her it was just a terrible misunderstanding. But I couldn't. I had to hold firm, no matter how much it hurt us both. Laura looked at me like I was insane, like I'd concocted some wild story out of nowhere. Her disbelief was palpable. I could see she wanted to trust me, but the truth was too much to process. So, I did the only thing I could, I pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling as I opened the picture I'd taken of Kate and Mike at the cafe. I turned the screen toward her. She stared at it in silence, her face frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The weight of the image, of undeniable proof, hit her like a tidal wave. It was as if the ground beneath us had disappeared, leaving only the unbearable truth hanging in the air between us. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. What could we say? Everything we thought we knew about our lives, our marriages, had been shattered in an instant. As much as I hated Mike and Kate for what they had done, my heart ached for Laura. She didn't deserve this. Neither of us did. But when the tears stopped, when the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place, anger. Raw, unfiltered anger. Laura clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stared off into the distance, her expression hardening with each passing second. They think they can just walk all over us, she muttered, her voice low and sharp. Like we don't matter. Her next words were like a spark igniting a fire. Let's set a trap, she said, her tone fierce, almost dangerous. Let's make sure they feel every second of it. Let them know what it's like. I nodded, the same rage coursing through me. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming something they had stolen from us. They had torn our lives apart and expected to walk away unscathed. But we weren't going to let that happen. Planning revenge turned out to be much easier than living through the pain they had caused. Laura and I sat together, mapping out how to destroy their little affair. At the time, it seemed so simple, meet up, make sure they see us, and let them feel the sting of betrayal. But as the night approached, the weight of what we were doing settled in. Beneath the anger, there was a deep sadness, a wound that no amount of vengeance could fully heal. Still, we were committed. No turning back. The night we chose arrived quickly. Laura came over to my place, and the tension in the air was thick. We both knew what had to happen, but that didn't make it any easier. There was an unspoken weight between us, a mix of anticipation, anger, and an undercurrent of grief. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about us, about clawing back some semblance of control over lives that had been torn apart. I remember standing there with Laura, each of us holding our emotions tightly in check, ready to do what needed to be done. Neither of us said it aloud, but we knew this night would change everything. Laura stood in the doorway, motionless, as if searching for the right words but finding none. I didn't know what to say either. After everything, words felt pointless. So, I simply gestured for her to come in. I poured us both a drink, and we sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us like a physical force. For a while, we just sat there, barely speaking, just existing in the same space. But somehow, that silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with shared pain, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. It was strange, sharing that pain with someone who truly understood felt like peeling away a layer of numbness I hadn't even realized was there. In that moment, Laura wasn't just a neighbor or a co-conspirator in revenge. She was someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be broken in the same way I was. Before I even realized what was happening, we were holding each other. It wasn't calculated, and it wasn't planned. It was instinctual, like we'd both fall apart if we let go. And maybe we would have. The kiss came naturally, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. For the first time in what felt like forever, the pain faded into the background. Mike, Kate, the consequences, it all disappeared. The only thing that mattered was Laura and me, two people clinging to each other in the wreckage of our lives. What happened next wasn't tender or sweet. It wasn't about love or romance. It was raw and urgent, driven by a volatile mix of anger, desperation, and the need to feel something, anything, other than the pain. In that moment, we weren't trying to destroy anyone else. We were trying, in our own fractured way, to put ourselves back together. We didn't know exactly when they'd return, but we were ready for them. When Mike and Kate walked in, they stepped right into the living room where Laura and I were tangled together on the couch. Laura's back was to them, but I could see their faces. The shock, the horror, the rage, it was all there, plain as day. Mike's eyes went wide, his whole body frozen for a second, like his brain couldn't even process what he was seeing. And Kate? Oh, her face twisted into something almost unrecognizable. Fury, disgust, disbelief, it was all there. Like she couldn't comprehend that I, of all people, would stoop to this. Like I was the one who'd betrayed her. Then everything erupted. Mike charged at me, shouting, his voice shaking with rage. How could you do this to me, Alex? After everything we've been through. I laughed bitterly, the sound cold and sharp in the air. Everything we've been through? You mean all those late nights with Kate? How could I do this? How about you explain yourself for once? Laura, still sitting there, pulled a blanket around herself, her eyes locked on Mike. If looks could kill, the daggers she was shooting him would have done the job. Meanwhile, Kate was still standing there, her face a mask of seething anger. The chaos of that moment was like a storm, but for the first time in weeks, I felt oddly calm. They were finally feeling a fraction of the pain they'd caused us. And they knew, there was no going back from this. I guess now you know how it feels, Laura said coldly, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around us. Mike and Kate were shouting, their voices clashing like thunder, hurling accusations, curses, and insults at each other. Kate's words carried this venomous edge, as if I'd somehow hurt her precious lover. It was surreal, watching her rage like she was the wronged party. That was the moment I knew, I was done. Done with the lies. Done with the cheating. Done with the endless excuses. They could have each other. Whatever fallout came next, they deserved it. Laura and I exchanged a glance, and without a word, we walked out of that house together, leaving Mike and Kate to deal with the mess they'd created. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight pressing down on me lifted. The world wasn't crashing down around me anymore. Instead, I felt free. Free of their betrayal, their deceit, their selfishness. Sure, it was messy and chaotic, but it was also real. And as I stepped outside with Laura by my side, I realized that whatever came next, I could handle it. Later, as Laura and I sat quietly, trying to process everything, I couldn't help but imagine the conversation happening back in that house. I pictured Kate and Mike scrambling to shift the blame, spinning the story to make me the villain, or Laura. But I didn't care. Let them twist the truth however they wanted. It wouldn't change what they'd done. Around midday, the storm finally came to me. Kate showed up, bursting through the door like a whirlwind, her face red and her eyes wild with fury. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she screamed, her voice cracking, tears threatening to spill over. I stayed calm, slowly walking toward her, meeting her gaze head-on. For the first time in ages, I felt no fear, no hesitation. "You want to talk about betrayal, Kate? About ruining what we had? You have the nerve to come in here, after everything you've done, and play the victim? Do you even hear yourself?" Her face contorted with frustration as she shouted back, "You slept with Laura." She spat the words like they were a trump card, her tone full of indignation. Like that was supposed to make everything even, erase her choices, her lies. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that sliced through the tension. "Yeah, Kate. I slept with Laura. But don't you dare stand there and act like you're blameless, like that changes what you've done. At least I had the guts to face you, to show you what you've been hiding from." Her bravado cracked. "It wasn't like that," she said weakly, her voice faltering. She looked at me, struggling to keep up the act, her eyes pleading. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Alex. I was confused. I was lonely. You don't understand." I stepped closer, my anger rising like a tidal wave. "You're right, Kate," I said, my voice low and steady. "I don't understand. I don't understand how you could do this to me. To us. To our marriage. I gave you everything, and you threw it away." Her mouth opened like she wanted to respond, but nothing came out. For once, she had no excuse, no defense. Just silence. And in that moment, I saw the truth laid bare in her eyes. She knew she'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. And I knew I was done trying. "I don't understand how you could look me in the eyes every day, Kate," I said, my voice raw but steady. "No more second chances. I'm done. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. We both do." And that was it. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, drowning in her tears and regrets. For the first time, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to save, no fight worth fighting. I was finished pretending that what we had was anything but broken. In the days that followed, everything exploded. The neighbors couldn't help but notice. How could they, with all the shouting and slamming doors? What was once the image of two happy couples, living an idyllic suburban life, had turned into a full-blown war zone. The lines were drawn, and there was no erasing them. Laura filed for divorce the very next week, and I knew I had to do the same. The process felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life crumble. Meetings with lawyers, dividing up our lives piece by piece, arguing over who got what, it was exhausting, emotionally and mentally. None of it felt real, but it was. And I had no choice but to face it head-on. Kate, of course, tried to salvage what was left. She called, texted, even showed up unannounced, pleading with me to save what we had. But the more I saw her, the clearer it became that what we'd had was already gone. One day, when she showed up on my doorstep again, I stopped her before she could even start. "I loved you, Kate," I said, meeting her eyes. "Once, I really did. But I don't love you anymore. And you don't love me. Maybe you did once, maybe I did too. But not anymore. And I won't spend the rest of my life pretending that's enough." Her face crumpled, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing like her entire world was falling apart. Maybe it was. But I didn't comfort her. I didn't reach out or offer any words of solace. I just stood there, watching the woman who had torn apart everything we'd built. She was a stranger to me now, a stranger wrapped in lies and betrayal. And I had nothing left to give. Kate and Mike. They could have each other. Let them spiral together, two snakes tangled up in their own toxic mess. As for me, I was ready to walk away, ready to start over, no matter how painful the process might be. Filing for divorce didn't feel like relief, it felt like stepping into the heart of a storm, knowing full well there was no way out except through it. But I was ready. Ready to burn it all down and take back my life, one step at a time. Ending a marriage isn't just about signing some papers and calling it quits, it's a drawn-out, messy, and often brutal process. I knew that filing for divorce would wreck what little remained of my old life, but I wasn't prepared for just how much of a battle it would be. It felt like a war that dragged on endlessly, with each new skirmish leaving deeper wounds. The moment Kate got her own lawyer involved, any hope I had for a clean break evaporated. Suddenly, it wasn't just about parting ways, it was about money, property, and who got what. She wanted the house, of course. She wanted alimony, claiming she needed financial support because her career wasn't as stable as mine. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. This was the same woman who'd spent who knows how long betraying me, and now she expected me to bankroll her future. Not a chance. We fought over everything, the car, the savings, even the furniture. Every conversation turned into a heated negotiation, dragging out the process longer than I could have imagined. The stress bled into every part of my life. It consumed my workdays, my nights, and even the moments I tried to spend distracting myself with friends or hobbies. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape the looming weight of the divorce. Every time it felt like we were close to a resolution, Kate would pull some new stunt to drag it out a little longer. Maybe she thought I'd give up, that I'd cave just to end the chaos. But I wasn't that man anymore. She had broken me once, but I'd rebuilt myself stronger. I was determined to see this through on my terms. During all of this, Mike kept his distance. I didn't hear much from him directly, though rumors of his fallout with Laura reached me through the grapevine. Laura and I stayed in touch throughout our divorces, supporting each other as we navigated the wreckage of our lives. But it was different now, platonic. We weren't seeking anything beyond friendship, and that's exactly what we needed. There was no drama, no expectations, just an unspoken understanding. We had both been through the fire, and somehow, we were still standing. It was comforting to know someone else truly understood the depth of the pain, but also the resolve it took to keep moving forward. Around that time, I began clawing my way back to some semblance of a normal life. I poured my anger and hurt into rebuilding myself. I'd hit the gym, run until my legs burned, and sweat out all the frustration that had been bottled up for too long. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again, or maybe, like someone entirely new. Someone stronger, sharper, and no longer willing to let the past define him. All I felt was exhaustion, physical, emotional, mental. But in a strange way, it worked. Each session at the gym became a process of chiseling away the old, broken pieces of myself and rebuilding, bit by bit. There were days when I didn't want to go, when the weight of everything made it tempting to stay in bed and let the world keep moving without me. But every time I forced myself to push through, I felt just a little bit stronger. Outside of the gym, I started reclaiming parts of myself I'd lost along the way. I dusted off my guitar, an old hobby I hadn't touched in years, and found comfort in the familiar feel of the strings under my fingers. I started reading again, losing myself in books that had once brought me joy. Little by little, these pieces of my old self returned, and each day felt just a little easier than the one before. Sleep came easier too. I began waking up without that heavy weight in my chest. Of course, there were still moments, those waves of memory that hit me out of nowhere. A flash of what Kate and I used to have, the good times we'd shared. And yeah, it hurt. But I was learning to let those moments pass instead of clinging to them. I realized that holding on to the past was like gripping broken glass, nothing but pain and blood. The divorce process dragged on in the background, still a source of frustration, but it didn't consume me the way it once had. Kate wanted what she wanted, and I had stopped caring. Let her fight over things that no longer mattered. My focus was on me, on who I was becoming, and that was more than enough. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix someone else's life or make a broken marriage work. I wasn't consumed with chasing something that was already gone. I was just living, one day at a time, one step at a time, moving forward. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. I felt like I could finally breathe again, like the crushing weight I'd been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. The day my divorce was finalized wasn't marked by any grand celebration or dramatic gestures. It was quiet, a subdued, almost anticlimactic end to a brutal chapter of my life. And yet, once it was over, I felt a strange, unexpected sense of peace. Slowly, I started reconnecting with the world around me. I spent time with old friends, laughing and catching up like no time had passed. I picked up my guitar again, jamming on familiar chords and enjoying the simplicity of it. Each little step brought me closer to who I used to be, or maybe, closer to who I was always meant to be. Laura and I didn't pursue anything beyond friendship after that night together. It was a moment we both needed at the time, but it didn't define our future. We continued supporting each other through the divorce process, sharing our struggles and frustrations, but we kept things strictly platonic. And I appreciated that. We both needed a clean slate, free from complications or entanglements. I started dating a bit, nothing serious, just putting myself out there again. I met new people, went out more, and rediscovered the joy of simple connections. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't searching for something to fill the void. I was content with where I was, rebuilding at my own pace. And for now, that was enough. The story didn't end with some dramatic revelation or Hollywood moment. It wasn't about getting even or finding new love to fill the void. The true ending came when I realized the most important thing, I was still standing. As the months passed, life started feeling lighter. Not perfect, not painless, but manageable. Every day, I took one step further from the chaos that Kate and Mike had dragged me into. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about thriving. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a man defined by betrayal and heartbreak. I became someone new, someone stronger, someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side. One evening, I found myself walking through the same neighborhood I once called home. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you feel alive, and I noticed how different everything looked. The house where I'd imagined a future with Kate was now just another building, the kind you pass by without a second thought. Mike and Kate. I heard they didn't last long. Whatever bond they thought they had, it couldn't withstand the weight of their lies. But by then, I didn't care. Their story wasn't my story anymore. Laura and I remained friends for a while, but as time passed, even that connection faded. We both moved on, each finding our own path out of the wreckage. She found her peace, and I found mine. I started traveling more, something I'd always wanted to do but kept putting off. I hiked mountains, kayaked rivers, and explored cities I'd only read about in books. Every new place felt like another piece of myself falling back into place. I met people who reminded me what it was like to trust again, to laugh without reservation, to enjoy life without fear of being blindsided. And while I didn't find the one, I found something just as valuable, the knowledge that I didn't need to. One night, sitting by a campfire under a sky filled with stars, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Kate, not at Mike, not at myself. They had taken so much from me, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my ability to rebuild, to grow, to love. And that night, with the flames crackling in the cool night air, I made a promise to myself, I wouldn't just move on, I would live. Life isn't a perfect story, wrapped up neatly with a bow. It's messy, unpredictable, and often unfair. But it's also beautiful, full of second chances and unexpected joys. I don't know where the next chapter will take me, but I do know this, I'll be ready. And this time, it's my story to write.